Welcome. My name is Randy Townsend from the American Geophysical Union, and I am proud to moderate this exciting and timely plenary, Anti-Racism Toolkits for Allies in Scholarly Publishing. It's significant to mention that today marks the 55th anniversary of the passing of the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices, and that we're still working towards equity and inclusiveness today. This year has highlighted the global unrest and demands for change against systemic racism and inequalities in various sectors. For many of us in scholarly publishing that look like me, you may feel as though your voice has not quite been heard, or that you are undermined by unconscious bias or undervalued by microaggressions. Please be reassured that there are allies out there that are working to change the climate and create an environment that is inclusive and equitable. Today's presenters will share a powerful initiative that they are leading to challenge the status quo and provide guidance to allies that may not be sure how to join those uncomfortable conversations that lead to change. Jocelyn Dawson is the journal's marketing manager at Duke University Press. She has served on committees of the Association of University Presses and the Society of Scholarly Publishing, and is a previous member of the SSP's board of directors. Nicole Coggins is the editorial design and production coordinator and assistant project editor for the University of Virginia Press. Gisela Fasado is the editorial director at Duke University Press and publishes books in a wide range of areas in the humanities and social sciences. Please join me in welcoming these incredible women to ISMTE. Moving on.
Before we begin our presentation, we would like to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land Duke University occupies is land that belongs to the Shakori and Catawba people. We acknowledge the University of Virginia sits on traditional water and lands of the Monacan people and on land worked by countless enslaved people of the African diaspora. Welcome to our panel. We would not have been able to do this work without our colleague, Melanie, at SSP, and the over 50 volunteers from across scholarly publishing, and the Triangle Scholarly Communications Institute. A very big thank you goes out to them. We developed this toolkit because despite university presses being predominantly liberal places, there are deep-rooted inequities that needed to be addressed. And while inclusivity issues have gained momentum, there is frustration with the lack of effective programs and solutions in place at our presses. This is what we mean by deep-rooted inequities in our industry. The SSP's Scholarly Kitchen published 2 articles filled with testimonials from Black, Indigenous, and people of color in scholarly publishing. Here are 2. During a diversity training at the press, we were asked when we first realized what our racial identity was. A middle-aged white woman at the press turned to me and laughed. "Well, you probably came out of the womb knowing." Her exclamation made clear to me how white people assume they are the default and that they are the only people without a racialized identity. Of course, I did not come out of the womb knowing that I was brown, and instead learned that I was brown sometime in elementary school through comments like this one and treatment that made me feel othered. Editors took many non-Black interns under their wing, and they were given numerous opportunities to rise up in the press. Black interns, on the other hand, were heavily micromanaged, and there was little interest in bonding with them or making them feel at home. I saw several white interns elevated to permanent positions. This is something I never saw offered as a possibility to Black interns. I did my best to provide some sense of belonging to the Black interns when I could. But honestly, how could I provide a feeling of belonging if it was something I never felt there myself? Moving on. In 2015, Lee and Lowe conducted a demographic survey of mainstream publishing houses and several university presses. You can see from the circle on the left that the publishing industry is 79% white overall. Then, when it is broken down into specific departments, 77% white is the marketing and publicity department, with the highest being book reviewers at 89% white. Moving on. Sorry, can we go back? It's right there, thank you. In 2019, Lee and Lowe did another demographic survey, this time concentrating on university presses, in addition to the mainstream publishing houses. Industry overall, 76% white. Then, when broken into specific departments, the lowest, marketing and publicity, at 74% white, and the highest, editorial, at 85% white. Added this year were two categories: literary agents, 80% white, and interns at 51% white. Now moving on into the toolkits themselves. We want to thank the American Alliance of Museums LGBTQ+ Alliance for their guides for transgender inclusion, which were the inspiration for our toolkits. And those guides are on the left. They have a coworker's guide, an institutional guide, and a transitioning professionals guide. Similarly, on the right, we have a guide for allies and plan to add a guide for organizations and a guide for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It is our belief that the work of organizational diversity committees and task forces would get a kickstart if professional associations could provide training materials and models to help transform our workplaces and organizational cultures. Building equity cannot be a top-down process or even bottom-up process, but it must be both, as well as what happens on an individual and interpersonal and a community level. Our vision is this: the Allies Toolkit on the right and future toolkits will provide a common framework for analysis, a common vocabulary and history, and best practices to address systemic inequities specific to the scholarly publishing industry. The toolkits will provide tailored materials to assist organizations in developing programming and best practices, to help bias-affected individuals constructively cope with their barriers, and to encourage colleagues to become allies for others. Moving on.
I'm going to give a quick summary of each guide. We started with the Guide for Allies, which launched today. And this is a guide intended primarily for white people, because especially in an industry as white as scholarly publishing, white people doing their own work to recognize and dismantle white supremacy is critical for meaningful change. And we'll share the URL for the presentation a little bit later. Moving on. Our second guide, which is still under development, is the Guide for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. We know from the testimonies of people of color that appeared in the Scholarly Kitchen, a few of which Nicole shared, and from hearing the experiences of our colleagues and friends, that most BIPOC individuals in scholarly publishing experience racism in the workplace. The BIPOC Toolkit will provide resources to help staff thrive in their career paths and find support and connection. Moving on. Our third kit for organizations is also under development. When we started the toolkit, we were concerned that we'd never be able to get organizations to see past legal and HR roadblocks and to do what it would take to create meaningful change. But in this time of growing awareness due to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others, we have seen organizations within our sphere make commitments to action. We are more optimistic that we might see anti-racism principles transform policy and workplace culture. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of how the project came to be. The project is hosted on the site of the Coalition for Diversity and Inclusion in Scholarly Communications. And it's now up, which we're very happy to say. Moving on. A lot of different roles came into play with this guide. There were 4 project organizers, but we really felt like it was critical to have people from across the industry contribute their voices. And we were also, as publishers, really committed to having a final product that was copy edited, proofread, and designed. And we really feel that our final product is stronger because so many people were involved. I wanted to call attention to two of the roles, which we felt were really important. The role of first reader. So these were folks that gave us feedback on an early draft and made sure we were on the right track. And then also tone reviewer. So in a document that had so many different voices, having someone come through and smooth that out was really useful. I also want to talk a little bit about our anti-racism framework. It's very heavily based on work by the Racial Equity Institute, which is based in Greensboro, North Carolina. It explicitly names white supremacy and identifies how the advantages that it grants function within scholarly publishing. And then we also acknowledge that whites and BIPOC individuals experience race in the workplace differently. Moving on. So some of the lessons, we really feel our project would have benefited from having a full-time employee move it forward. It ended up taking about 10 months because we were all doing it in addition to our full-time jobs. And we also knew this as publishers, but by being on the author side of things and working with our copy editor and proofreader and designer, it really illustrated the value that publishing brings to the process. Copy editors ask really tough, really good questions, and we know our project is stronger as a result.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gisela Fosado. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the editorial director at Duke University Press. So, over the years, as you've probably witnessed, our scholarly publishing conferences have been ramping up conversations about racial equity and the lack of diversity within publishing. And we, as leaders of this toolkit project, we're seeing a lot of well-meaning white people who were eager for tools to help them figure out how to get started in becoming an anti-racism ally/accomplice. It was in this context that Jocelyn wrote the proposal to the Triangle Scholarly Communications Institute and invited several of us to join the team. One thing we emphasize in the toolkit introduction is that becoming an ally is a lifelong journey. It's not something you can just do by checking off a few boxes and then going back to the normal state of things. It's not a quick update to be made to a mission statement or a challenge that a short-term task force can address. It is hard personal work that is essential to creating thriving scholarly ecosystems. And like those of us involved in creating these toolkits, we know that you will find anti-racism to be life-changing, urgent work that will transform your life and all of your relationships in healing and life-affirming ways. So this toolkit is meant to get white people started on this journey. If you could please go back. There are 5 main sections to the body of the text of the Toolkits for Allies that represent what we've outlined as the 5 crucial steps to becoming an ally. 1, as you see here on the slide, become conscious of white advantage or white privilege. 2, listen to people of color without judgment or defensiveness. 3, move out of social segregation and develop truth-telling relationships of accountability. 4, take action to interrupt racism and white advantage at all levels. 5, create work communities where everyone thrives. We're going to go into these all in a minute, but first I want to mention a couple of the helpful appendices that we included in the toolkit. Next slide, please. Appendix 1 features a chronology of white supremacy in the US, drawn, excerpted, and edited from a longer version that is part of the Racial Equity Institute's workbook. As REI notes, the story of race is the story of labor. The chronology makes clear that the historical and institutional foundations of racism are all about labor exploitation. The US has allowed folks into the family of white, quote unquote, as we needed their labor, and we pushed them out when we don't. Covering 4 centuries in 5 short pages, the appendix lists all of the key laws that work to systematically disempower, disenfranchise, and otherwise exclude Black, Indigenous, and people of color while giving advantage, wealth, and power to whites. Next slide, please. Appendices 2 and 3 include lists of sample equity and inclusion programming from across the scholarly publishing industry. as well as examples of ways that organizations have formed affinity groups. Quite a few organizations are holding film screenings of, for example, I Am Not Your Negro, directed by Raoul Peck and based upon an essay by James Baldwin. Many presses are holding book discussions, formal training sessions on anti-bias and bystander training, and have introduced initiatives and new policies to promote equity from both among staff and also among other stakeholders of our organizations, including authors. This is really helpful because there's no need for any of us to create things from scratch. Some organizations are doing excellent work. Next slide, please. Appendix 4 includes a list of recommended anti-racism training organizations. There are quite a few organizations out there that do diversity work and utilize approaches that aim to get a few brown faces into organizations or offer other Band-Aid solutions. We feel that these kinds of approaches don't really get at the root of the problem. So we encourage folks to check out the organizations in this appendix that explicitly adopt an anti-racism approach. As we mentioned, the toolkit for allies is available today. We can't wait for you to see it. I have to say that it is it's been one of the most meaningful and beautiful collaborations I've ever been a part of, with over 50 scholarly communications professionals across the industry pitching in to make this a reality. Many of our collaborators went above and beyond in how they shared their talent and worked so hard over the last 10 or so months, 6 to 10 months. And I personally have learned so much along the way, and hope that you will find the toolkit helpful within your own organization and also within your own personal journey. So next slide, we just want to encourage you to add your questions to the Whova Q&A. We are going to basically go through the 5 steps of how to become an ally now, but we'd love to take questions after.
All right, so now we'll get into the steps to becoming an ally. The first step is to become conscious of white advantage. Moving on. So when many of us think of, next slide. When many of us think about inequality, we often turn our focus to marginalized groups in order to see inequality or disadvantage. But what about trying to see the advantages that dominant groups hold? Next slide. One resource we really recommend, and it's been around a while and you can find it easily on Google, is Peggy McIntosh's White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And this is a really useful tool for helping to understand white advantage and unpack the advantages of white supremacy. Next slide.
Step number 2 to becoming an ally. Listen to Black, Indigenous, people of color without judgment or defensiveness. So how does someone do that? Next slide, please. By using the LARA approach for receiving and giving feedback. L, listen, with the goal of developing empathy for the speaker. Set aside your own perspective. A, affirm, with the goal of building connection. R, respond, with the goal of addressing the speaker's questions or concerns directly. A, ask questions, add information, with the goal of furthering our understanding of the speaker's point of view. But what if criticism comes up? With advice from Francesca Ramsey, here's how to respond to criticism. Acknowledge what went wrong. Avoid using conditional words like but or if. Thank the person for bringing the mistake to your attention. Do not just apologize with words, but change your behavior and do what you can to mitigate the impact of the mistake. Moving on.
Step 3 to becoming an ally. Move out of social segregation and develop truth-telling relationships of accountability with diverse groups of people. This section emphasizes that becoming trustworthy allies is something that white people can't do on their own. It's something that must be done with humility and in partnership with Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Otherwise, it's likely that you'll do more harm than good. There's this tendency to replicate old patterns of missionary zeal through a white savior complex that run the risk of jeopardizing the people that white people are presuming to help. Moving out of social segregation will require intentionality because so many of our communities and workplaces have been segregated for so long. Our series editors are white, our freelancers are white, our vendors are predominantly white. It'll mean experiencing some discomfort reaching out to communities across difference. Calls and emails may not be initially answered, but the work of building new networks and new relationships that are mutually beneficial is essential. Some of the things we recommend for people in scholarly communications is, for example, before travel to a conference, consider who we are reaching out to for meetings and meals. Make an effort to diversify this group with each new conference. Check in with coworkers if we think we've witnessed or committed a racialized microaggression in the workplace, similar to what Nicole outlined in step 2. Receive feedback from our coworkers with gratitude and appreciation again. If a BIPOC colleague raises a concern that is ignored or dismissed by the group, circle back to amplify their statement. Next slide, please. If an author requests a style or spelling that doesn't follow our usual copy editing guidelines, for example, retaining Chinese characters instead of English, make sure the copy editor knows to respect the author's preference. Better yet, find a copy editor familiar with the language used in the book or article. We have so many systems and workflows in place within our industry that aim for efficiency, but sometimes these efficiencies are made with white cultural norms embedded. And so we must question, even if it takes more time and energy. Post all jobs and internships publicly and interview at least 3 candidates who have the job skills to learn the job. This is a tough one for our industry because where so many people from economic privilege gain beneficial experience through unpaid internships or low paid entry-level jobs. Work must be done to create on-ramps for everyone without those advantages. Our jobs aren't rocket science. Everyone can learn how to be a publisher.
Step 4 is to take action to interrupt racism and white advantage at all levels. Moving on. So we have a lot in the guide, but the one tactic I want to highlight here is bystander intervention. When racial harm is done in the workplace, the involvement of bystanders can play a key role in reducing trauma. One study from the group IHALABAC showed that even when a bystander exchanges a knowing glance with a victim, it can reduce the impact of these incidents. So important. We would love for readers of our guide to go further. We would love for them to engage colleagues when they misstep and offer support to the individuals who are experiencing harassment. IHALABAC has 5 different tactics. I'm going to go over one that I think works well for the workplace. Back one slide. So give the individual being targeted a chance to respond. If the individual is not prepared to respond and it's safe for you to do so, directly address the offender and tell them that their comment is inappropriate. Afterward, check in with the individual who was targeted, ask them how they're doing, ask what you can do to help. Could you help them create documentation? Could you reach out to the offender and offer to explain why their comment was inappropriate? And there's a lot more to bystander intervention and a lot more to other intervention tactics. So definitely check out the guide. Moving on.
Step number 5 to becoming an ally. Create work communities where everyone thrives. What does that mean? It means replacing a culture of perfectionism, which is an aspect of white supremacy, with a culture of appreciation and growth. Quote from Tima Okun, develop a culture of appreciation where the organization takes time to make sure that everybody's work and efforts are appreciated. Develop a learning organization where it is expected that everyone will make mistakes, and those mistakes offer opportunities for learning. Next slide, please. The next one. Perfect. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's quote from Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria is a really great example of why we chose to chose an anti-racism framework. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on a conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving with it. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racist ahead of them, and choose to turn around, unwilling to go to the same destination as the white supremacists. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others.
So we can take some questions.
Great. Thank you, ladies. Thank you for that presentation. We actually do have a few questions that have come through, and I'll just remind everybody that's participating and watching and joining us, please, if you do have questions, submit them through the Hoover app for that board, and we'll capture them and have that and share that with the panelists. First, I do want to make a quick mention that the toolkits are featured in the Scholarly Kitchen today. If you haven't read that post, please do. So the first question is, how do we strive for inclusivity without focusing so hard on diversity to the point that we inadvertently resort to fill a spot with a token person that meets a diversity criteria, therefore focusing so much on what makes them other that we create a harmful environment and forget their humanity and being hospitable so all feel welcomed and included?
I have some thoughts, but Nicole, I see you unmuted yourself. Do you want to go first?
I'm fine. I've been thinking.
Yeah, I would say that you won't be in that position if you do a really, really good job of broadening your outreach efforts. So I think that it's really incumbent upon all of us to not just go to our own networks when we're posting jobs, I think, or making a recommendation to the hiring manager because you've heard that so-and-so was so-and-so's intern. One of the things that we recommend is moving out of social segregation. And I think that by doing that, we broaden our networks. And if we do share a job to LinkedIn or another site, we're reaching a broader pool of people. And this is a place where I think staff can really partner with HR. I think that we at Duke University Press have done a really good job of working with our HR department to ensure that our jobs are not just posted to Duke and UNC, the historically white universities in our area, but also to the HBCUs around us. That hadn't been done before. And there's also a lot of professional organizations for BIPOC individuals, for example, a group for designers. So you can try and broaden your pools that way. But I think, I think if you have only one person of color in your pool, that's a problem outside of anything else.
I also want to add that one of the aspects that we were really keen on having for our toolkits is a shared vocabulary and a shared history. Because what we've noticed is that, you can walk into a room and end up with 10 different definitions of what exactly does diversity mean, what's race, what's racism. And having gone through the anti-racism training from the Racial Equity Institute, they start with everybody agreeing on what the definition of the words are. So that was something that we as a group, those of us that got together, is that we wanted to make sure that we were all talking about the same thing. So if you and your organization are talking about inclusivity, define what that is, define what diversity is, and then go from there. And make sure that when people want to start changing inclusivity to be to tokenizing people, then you bring them back to the definition that everybody had agreed upon. So that's very important, and that's why we have a chronology. You wouldn't think that a chronology would be important for a tool, for an anti-racism toolkit, but if we can all agree on particular events and the undergirding of those events, then it just makes moving forward a lot easier. Even though the process isn't going to be easy itself, it will make everything just a little bit smoother.
I'll just add one quick thing. Within the university press world, we had a Mellon Diversity Fellowship program that really did try to get the word out about publishing jobs in editorial to a broader range of people. And every time I've heard people talk about the kinds of pools, the kinds of candidate pools that we saw in those jobs, it's like, wow, people were, it was just like the most overqualified, super talented pools of people, because we really got the word out about the industry, about these jobs. And for so long, I think a lot of organizations rely on these same networks of people we know, people, and it's like a tight little circle, and it tends to be very homogenous. So it really is important to broaden our networks.
Great. There's another question here. Lupe Soto shared an experience about seeing white colleagues treated better, for example, being named first in the masthead despite having less tenure. What do you recommend for addressing situations like this in the workplace? Here, yes.
Nicole, do you want to start?
Well, I'm trying to think of where, is the person that has noticed, are they BIPOC? Is it safe for them to mention that? Because first and foremost, it's the person's safety. They don't want to be labeled a troublemaker. So if it's safe for them, or if they have a colleague that's maybe in a safer position, to address that issue would be my recommendation.
I agree. I want to second that. I think this is where becoming an ally really can be really important, because I don't know, I've certainly experienced it myself, where I've just been the person who just forgets to be invited to the department, lunch or whatever. And it's just, it's hard to be the person to always be like, hey, don't forget about me. I think everyone has to work hard to make sure that people aren't more marginalized, especially when there's only one person of color in a department.
Yeah, I'm really sorry that happened to you, Lupe. And I think this is another place where mentorship relationships can come in handy. Like Nicole and Hisala have said, I think having a trusted person that you can go to within your organization who knows those dynamics can be really useful.
Great. Here's another question. So what challenges and advantages does working primarily in an all virtual environment lend to anti-racism efforts?
Actually, I just had some conversations with some colleagues at the university at a different press. I won't name the press, but they were struggling. Like, how do I start putting together a group? How do I start doing this work? If there are just a few of us at this small organization, like, how do we do that? And it occurred to me that all of our meetings right now are virtual. Like, there's no reason why organizations can't combine their efforts and really. So I really was encouraging them to think about partnering with us. I think this is a really great time to partner with other organizations that are already doing work and building off of those efforts and finding ways to network and yeah, grow together.
Randy, I'm reminded of a comment that you made in one of our planning sessions about how your organization has seen this huge increase in submissions to its annual conference because people from all over the world can now present virtually if they have, you know, a reliable internet connection. So I think, you know, so frequently at scholarly publishing meetings, you do have people who are higher up in the hierarchy going to the meetings, and then they benefit from increasing their networks. And those people tend to be white because they've been in the industry and longer and have benefited from those advantages. So I think, you know, I think this is a really good opportunity to level the playing field a little bit, allow more staff at different levels of the organization to go to these conferences and widen their networks.
Nicole and I were two of the people who started a listserv for people of color in scholarly publishing. And I think because we're in an industry where many times people are just one of a handful of people who are people of color within their organizations, these online, virtual ways of connecting are essential.
Here's another question here. How do you feel about movements to go beyond the word ally? We've seen words like co-conspirator or accomplice in the context of abolition of racism. Does the toolkit go into that active work mainly in Section 5?
Hisala and Jocelyn, correct me if I'm remembering wrong, but I know that we did struggle with using the word ally, and we decided to stick with that word, partially because there's already an understanding of what it means, and I did get into a discussion with one of our volunteers about because one volunteer wanted to use the word accomplice and really didn't have a problem using the word accomplice, and then another volunteer felt very strongly that accomplice was really buying into the sort of you know, prison lexicon and bringing that into our vocabulary. And so maybe co-conspirator is maybe the way, you know, the way to go, because it's true, and it's become more apparent with these protests that are going on that BIPOC, we're just we're a part of it, but we're sort of on the receiving end. We really want our white colleagues, white family members, white friends to take this on and really move forward with it. I was reminded at a presentation last week that white people have their own abolition history, have their own anti-racism history that they need to start teaching themselves. You know, Albert Einstein, despite being a brilliant scientist, he was also an anti-racist, but not very many people know that about him. So yeah, maybe co-conspirator will be the phrase.
I think what Nicole's saying is so important because so many times people look to the people of color in the organizations to do the work. Okay, tell us what we need to do, you know, and that's, you know, that's a big burden that we don't need about, you know, on top of all the other things we have to do in organizations. Like, you know, it is a journey, and and we want to encourage white people to embrace that journey because it's a really great journey that that will be hard work, but it's work that is essential for white people to do because they are the people who have advantages in society because of white supremacy.
Great. Thank you for that. Here's another question. Has there been consideration of concern that the acronym BIPOC may not include some groups of non-white people who do not feel included by the term people of color?
There's so, I know BIPOC is not the end point. There's no point, you know, in all of these movements, there is no end point. There's always, with each new term, we're opening up more questions, and I think there are erasures always with any term, but we felt that this was an important term to use, and it's something that's being adopted across movements right now. But I'm sure the toolkit will need updating in another 5 to 10 years.
How do we identify and dismantle the whiteness or structures of racism that are supporting our current practices? This is a big question.
One thing our colleague, Kathy Reimer-Searles, who's done a lot of work at the press, one thing that she talks about is when you're in a room, whether it's a Zoom room or another room, to always be thinking about, you know, who else is in the room, who holds the power in the room, and just be asking those questions all the time. So that could be a starting point for thinking about it. And then, yeah, I hope that we've given some good advice in the toolkit for actions that individuals can take, but I really think it is about a shift in the institutional power within our industry, but within society as a whole that really needs to happen.
Yeah, keep asking those questions. Why is this meeting all white? Why are all the people on the making decisions all white? You know, and just don't allow it to just be, well, this is the way things are. This is the way it's always been. No, that's not enough. Keep asking and keep reading and keep doing the work. And read our toolkit.
All right, here's another question. I'm not sure how much time we have for questions, but here's another one. For those of us working on our allyship, are there appropriate ways to offer our support to BIPOC colleagues without creating extra pressure on those very same colleagues?
We talk about that in the toolkit, that you have to work to create mutually beneficial relationships. And that does mean if you find that all of your friends are white, you're in organizations that are all white, you're going to have to do some work to join movements led by people of color and work to support those movements and work to make change in your community and work, it's going to be work on a bunch of different levels, but just enjoying your white communities is not going to make the kind of change that is needed.
And I'd also like to echo that our toolkits are just a beginning. And like any other toolkit, you'll keep adding tools through the kit. And so, yes, our toolkits are a beginning. It's not an end. You may discover, a step 6 and a 7 and 8 and a 9 and a 10. So we encourage everybody to read the toolkits, start there. And then as you go on this journey of anti-racism, you will find what works. And you'll be in conversation with other people. And you're gonna be uncomfortable. Just sort of, take that as a give, that you're gonna be uncomfortable. And so, but start somewhere, and I think starting with the toolkits would be great.
In the toolkit, as we mentioned, it has a list of really great organizations that do anti-racism training. Many of them are doing online training right now, so it might be a more accessible time to have, as we were talking about this remote situation really opening up possibilities. I know the Racial Equity Institute is now doing virtual training. So yeah, check out the appendices for different things that people are doing to engage with these ideas.
This next question is actually my own personal question, and I kind of cheated a little bit because I had the sneak preview of the toolkits as an early reader. And looking at the statistics that Nicole shared on her slides earlier on the presentation, my question to you all is, what, as you thought about this project and you approached it and started the discussions, why did you think, what made you think that scholarly publishing as an industry was ready for this type of discussion? It is uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable reading it as an early reader. So why do you think now is the time for this initiative?
When I think back to the first sort of moment in scholarly publishing where I heard people address the elephant in the room, it was a meeting where Amy Brand, Al Greco, and a third individual whose name I can't remember, but they shared a demographic study that they published in Learned Publishing, where the demographics, they were even worse than what Nicole shared in terms of just the complete underrepresentation of people of color. So I think from that moment, we started to see task forces pop up, and then the task forces had to become committees. And then, at least with the Society for Scholarly Publishing, what I've seen is that the committee that Randy chairs, there's just this there's this enthusiasm that I haven't seen at other committees. So many people have wanted to have these conversations and are ready to do the work and are willing to do the work. And it goes off in so many different directions. People planning content for the annual meeting, people thinking about reaching out to students, so many different things can be done. So I think in the fall, when we started this guide at the Triangle Scholarly Communications Institute, we really had to decide if we were going to use terms like white supremacy, which hasn't really been bandied about in scholarly publishing very much. But I think we felt it was important at that time, and it really seems like we're now at a moment in our society where people see how critically important it is to use those terms and to name the problem. And so I do hope that we are at a time where organizations, particularly organizations, not just individuals, but are ready to actually put actions behind the statements that they've made in light of everything that's happened this spring. So yeah, I think that's it for me. Giselle and Nicole, do you have things to add there?
Just to emphasize, it's true. We had some hard conversations at the beginning of this project. Do we use white supremacy? Like, that was a huge one. And can we really take an anti-racism approach? Because some people wanted the Band-Aid, the diversity, like let's get a couple diversity fellows and then we'll be done. That I think that there was that feeling, but I think the three of us and our other collaborators were clear, no, we need anti-racism. We need to really question the underlying reasons why people of color aren't thriving in this industry.
And why, and often when we've seen maybe a BIPOC individual is hired, but then they don't stay with the organization because the workplace culture isn't welcoming. So I think this movement from seeing diversity and talking about pipeline program, we know those things don't work. We know we knew that this needed to be substantially different, or no one was going to pay attention to it. It would just be the same old thing.
I would also add that the Mellon Diversity Fellows program, which started in the fall of 2016, also kind of, I think, made personalized the issue for some presses, because here you had a young, bright, energetic BIPOC that was exploring publishing, and then they decide not to, so it actually starts to, rather than just be, you see the survey data, it's no longer numbers, it's an actual human being that's being affected by this. So there's that, there's the we need diverse books, So I think everything has just been like a building block on top of each other. And it just so, happens that, scholarly publishing was where we all happened to meet at the same time. But also, I mean, we publish awesome stuff, awesome scholarship that's talking about decolonizing and anti-racism. But then the presses themselves aren't. They're liberal, but they aren't decolonized. They aren't anti-racist. So I think it's time that we follow through on some of the scholarship that we publish, and that we actually do what we put out there in the world, that we represent what we're putting out into the world. So, yeah.
Hey, great. I think we have two more questions. So this first one, in addition to addressing these issues within our own organizations, are there any larger initiatives to push for change on an industry-wide level?
Well, the organization that's hosting the guides, C4DISC, is, it's umbrella organization is the right term, but it's an organization that's publishing organizations, library organizations that are coming together to kind of agree on a joint statement of principles. And then I think they're hoping to come up with their own, trying not to say deliverables, it's very businessy, but their own products, their own materials. So yeah, and so I think I'm looking forward to seeing what they do in the years ahead. And then we know that AU Presses and the Society for Scholarly Publishing are doing great things. But yeah, so I think getting involved in one of those committees would be a great starting point.
Great. One more question. When will a toolkit for organizations be available? Do you have any preliminary suggestions on how to entrench anti-racism as a shared cultural value in a company?
We have begun the outlines for the other two toolkits. This took so much out of us. We would love to, if anyone has interest in joining the work that we're doing, resources, like, as Jocelyn mentioned in one of her slides, like if we had a full-time employee working on these toolkits, we could have done it much faster and not practically killed ourselves. So yes, we do have ideas. We welcome more ideas, and we absolutely welcome people who want to contribute time, energy, resources, anything. So please get in touch with us.
You can email equitytoolkits@gmail.com. And I'm really looking forward to seeing, all the folks that are engaged with this work. There are people in leadership positions already involved, but, as folks that have anti-racist values go into those positions of leadership, become directors of publishing companies, of presses, I think that's going to be really transformative.
Great. I think that may have been the last question. I'm not seeing anything else in here. So with that, I would like to thank you all for joining us here at ISMTE for this really incredible session. It's been amazing, very informative. Congratulations on the release of the toolkit. I know I'm aware of how much work went into it and how powerful it is. I do encourage everybody who's attending the session or will view it later on to take a look at the toolkits and reach out to that email address if you'd like to contribute. What was that email address one more time, Jocelyn?
equitytoolkits@gmail.com. I don't have Huva up, so I'll put it in Zoom, but.
Perfect. And I'd also like to thank Donna and Kim, who've really just been doing an amazing job here at ISMTE and for facilitating this particular session. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Randy.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone.
Everybody.